Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. We're going to China today, but well, maybe not quite to China because our speakers are all here in Canada and two of them know each other and the third doesn't. So we are all going to get caught up with getting acquainted and figuring out what's going on in the world with China. Now, these people have not had any opportunity to talk in advance about what we're going to say. So we have no game plan, which gives me the opportunity right now to kind of set it up and say what I hope we talk about, which is I want us to take a big view of China in the world over the past 50 years. Now, I guess the baseline for me was 45 years ago, which was the only time that I have been in China, and that was in 1980. And it was just opening up to tourism. People would stare at us and press their nose against the window of the bus to have a good look at us in those days. I'm sure they don't do that anymore. And from our perspective as Western tourists, we kind of pitied them. We admired them, but we also rather pitied them because we knew they didn't have democracy, and we pitied the recent past, which they had been through the revolution, they had been through the Maoism, they'd been through the Cultural Revolution, the whole repressive period, which we thought was tragic. But we thought that we should just sort of humor China, and that if we helped them develop, they would, of course, see the benefits of democracy and capitalism, and they would come around to our point of view. So that was the general approach then. We internally, they were not politically well developed, but we kind of had hope for them. And internationally, China was not really considered a threat at the time. It wasn't a big power, and it had nuclear weapons, but not enough to worry about. And so we kind of had an optimistic view that we should all play nicely together, and with development, they'd get the good ideas about democracy, and we would all live happily together afterwards. Well, now it's 45 years later, and it's not gone the way I expected. Internally, there's been enormous growth in terms of technology and the economy. They're running circles around us in many ways, and we're neck and neck in the search for artificial intelligence and AGI. And they're still not a democracy. I don't see any desire for that. And they are a bit of more of a challenge internationally. We have the case of they took over Hong Kong. It looks like they might want to get active about recapturing Taiwan or regaining Taiwan. There's the plight of the Uyghurs, and they're building nuclear weapons facilities. All those things make us should or logically would worry us compared to the way we thought about things 45 years ago. But in fact, I think today people do not see China as the bad guy in the world. They've been pretty damn responsible in the way they compete with the West. They've been offering goodies to other countries rather than invading. They have this Belt and Road Initiative, which I don't know whether it's good for other countries or not, but it's certainly better than invading them. They have, and in terms of global warming, they're doing better. They're producing almost all of the solar panels in the world. They're doing very well, and I think that the countries that are regarded as the bad guys in the world are not China at all, but Russia, the U.S. and Israel right now. With a marginal status, I guess, for India. And so we have a different point of view than this is my outlook of the changes that have taken place over the last 45, 50 years. So now I want to open it up and have everybody tell me how wrong I am and how we really should look at things. Please interrupt each other, agree or disagree, and treat it as if you're off in a coffee shop and I'm not even here. I want to introduce my friend Ellen Judd first, just because she got here first. Ellen Judd is a retired or a professor emeritus of anthropology from the University of Manitoba. And she's worked in China many, many years, doing field research on political economy and the social implications of large scale migration from rural West China to the urban and coastal regions. So, and I know Ellen because we're both members of the Canadian Pugwash Group. Jeremy Paltiel is a professor emeritus of political science at Carleton University, and he specializes in government and foreign policies of Asia. And he's a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. Did I get that right, Jeremy? Everything okay on there?
Fine. Perfectly fine.
Okay, and Jeff Mahan. Jeff Mahan is the Director of Geopolitical and International Business Advisory at a consulting firm, Strategy Corp. And previously, he served as the Deputy Director at Global Affairs Canada's China Division. So he knows his way around too. Okay, sounds good.
I mean, I've just come back from China, so I suppose I'm as qualified as anyone to start.
Mhm.
I would say that although in some respects you're right that China is not the bad guy to some people, although I would say generally in Canada, China is not well regarded and is not well regarded officially. And at the same time, I would say that perhaps from a certain perspective, your view is perhaps overly benign. I mean, China is a great power. It is not entirely benign. Certainly, people in Hong Kong would not feel that way, or in Taiwan, and nor will its neighbors to the south around the South China Sea. So it's not entirely benign, but in comparison to the United States, of course, China is not the country that is threatened to annex us. So that concentrates the mind somewhat, and China does see itself as an upholder of the rules-based international order, but in ways which it also wants to revise. So that's the question that some people was. So in other words, China claims not to want to upset the world order, except to wants to democratize the world order. Now, there are nuances within that some people will disagree with. Certainly, when I was in China and I spoke in 5 or 6 different cities and spoke to many different people, there is not one person I met who wants China to take over the world. So that kind of perception that China seeks to take over, and often there's a mistranslation. When China's President Xi Jinping stated in 2017 at the 19th Party Congress that he wants China to be a world power second to none in 2047. He said second to none. He didn't say we want China to dominate the world. And that's often translated as China is seeking to dominate the world. And I mean, there are many people, myself possibly even included, who doesn't want China to be so dominant necessarily, but not necessarily that that the United States has been a dominant power that we all want to adhere to, as we have recently seen. So that's the situation. And again, in terms of society. I spoke to many people. There are many people who have, and people in high who are concerned about the government's emphasis on national security and what that means for individual freedom. People do care about those things. It's not that they don't care about those things, but at the same time, they have a high level of trust in the government. One person immediately spoke up to me and says,
You're talking about the Chinese. having had
Chinese people, yeah.
they do trust the government. You have that feeling, huh?
It's not just my feeling. Polls show it among the Chinese trust their government more than people in most countries in the world.
Hmm.
So the polls do show that. And at the same time, and to give you this a vignette to somebody who come up to me, things things sometimes are difficult in China. You have to do everything on your phone right now. You can't pay for anything without your phone. You can't go anywhere without your phone. You can't find anything without your phone. Everything is on your phone. And sometimes if you're without your phone or you don't know how to use the phone, there's a little helpless. But as one person said to me, quite spontaneously, says, if I need help, I ask a policeman. So that gives you some sense of both trust in government and how they view their officials, even though the same person in different circumstances might see state that some of the surveillance and some of the controls, for example, during COVID, were intrusive and something that they didn't like. But on a general level, they feel that their lives are getting better compared to other people in the world, and that the government on the whole looks out for them.
I think one of the challenges we're having is kind of how it was even framed at the beginning of the good guys versus the bad guys. And I don't think the world's so clear anymore as some of your remarks and Jeremy's remarks have elaborated on. There are certainly elements, as Jeremy stated, that create some challenges and frictions in our relationship and Canada's relationship with China. And also, some concerns that Canada would have in terms of China's own governance model, both politically and economically. And because of that, because of also, as you talked at the beginning, how China's power rise, its economic footprint has just exploded over the last 40 years, and particularly so over the last 20 years. So while China is now the world's second largest economy, it's the world's largest exporter. Over this time period, it has displaced the United States as being the number one trade partner with many countries around the world, not Canada, but there is growing trade there as well. And with this rise of its material power, both its economic capability, which then in turn affects its military or security capability, that affects its political power as well. And then, of course, there's soft power, but I'll focus more on the material hard power at the moment before getting there. This has created a bit of a challenge for Canada, obviously for the United States, as they've been the most aggressive in dealing with China, but also the European Union and others. So over the last decade or so since the Trump 1.0 administration came in, we've seen a bit of a sea turn or sea change in how we're dealing with China. And it's really in reaction to its rise, but also because it used a different approach in its governing that started to create some questions. And trade has been an area where this fight has really been colliding. Things have really hit at the trade element, because China has a very different economic system in the sense that the government, like all governments, intervene in the market. There's no such thing as a market without the government, but China has a very different approach than liberal market democracies do for governing of the economy. In China, the government there's a plethora of state-owned enterprises, but there's also a mixture of industrial policies and market access barriers. There are areas where China is quite open and trade is happening fairly smoothly, or within China's own domestic market, where it's almost like a Wild West type capitalist system. But there's various different segments. And those strategic sectors, whether through the state-owned enterprises or in high tech, or critical supply chains, automotives, aerospace, the like, where there's a little bit of a mix of either public leadership, by public, I mean private leadership or government leadership. And this new model has been very successful So I know folks talked about China being upholding the rules-based international order. At least when it comes to trade, there's more question marks there. China does not have too many losses at the World Trade Organization and the dispute settlement mechanisms there. So we can interpret from that, one, that China isn't breaking the rules, or they find different ways of settling disputes before they can get to determinations.
What would that be?
Canada, for example, had launched a trade dispute through the WTO when China locked down our canola in response to the three M's crisis, Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels.
Mm-hmm.
When that happened, China blocked.
Tell the world who the two Michaels were, because
Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, two Canadians who were detained by China in response to our detaining of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou back in late 2018. And in early 2019, China revoked the import licenses for a couple of Canadian exporters that were exporting canola into China. And this is our largest export to China. So it had a huge economic impact. And Canada launched
motivated by some political.
Yeah, it was motivated in retaliation for an unrelated political dispute. And so that's actually what we're seeing a lot happening around the world today. And indeed, Canada and this similar type situation happened with Australia. So Canada, Australia, the US, the UK, and New Zealand got together and actually with Japan, and they took they made a statement against economic coercion. And this word has been popping up a lot more, particularly as we've been dealing with the United States.
Actually, ironic,
yeah, but that's
isn't it?
Economic coercion is something that happens when things get mixed. Yeah. So economic retaliation or punishment is used to deter or punish for unrelated diplomatic or political instances. So the lines start to blur. And originally, now there's a lot of attention on the United States for this, and indeed they are clearly guilty of that with activities that have been happening over the past few weeks here, few months since the Trump administration's come back into power. But we started leveling these accusations at China over the last 5 or 6 years. And so that's one example. But these ultimately didn't make it to the WTO final dispute settlement because we were able to find a way out of that. China improved the market access, and these cases were suspended. Other instances where it comes to the rules, it's not so much necessarily that China's breaking the rules, but whether or not there's too much ambiguity, or the question of the spirit versus the letter of the law. Mm-hmm. So regulating state-owned enterprises, regulating technology transfer. These are some areas that have been a big concern amongst Europe, Canada, United States, and other countries, at the technological frontier. And so that precipitated. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of want to know whether you think this is built in, that it's inevitable and can't be overcome, or whether we've just sort of wiggled our way, unfortunately, into being adversaries. Could we make a deal? Is there a way to reverse this intransigent, tit-for-tat, retaliatory trade conflict, or is it just there's something irrevocable about the relationship between China and the rest of the world? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it a big mistake that we could fix if we put our mind to it, or is it just impossible to solve?
I'll be brief so others can weigh in, but I think it is possible to solve it, but it's going to require some changes. There was a period where we thought we could just muscle China into changing its policies, that if, indeed some of this Trump reaction is meant to try to use the stick rather than the carrot to get China to become a bit more of a, have the same types of economic or political system that we have. I don't think that we're going to be able to do that. So what's going to need to happen is we're going to need to come up with a new modus vivendi where we recognize the legitimacy of China to have its own economic development model. But in turn, China also has to recognize our legitimacy to have our own and different economic development model. And the simple fact is that two different models are going to create frictions. So we need to be able to identify ways to manage those frictions so that we don't have this spiral of tit for tat. But that's going to require not just the Chinese side making some concessions, but also liberal market democracies, Canada, US, the European Union, are going to have to give up the dream of trying to use the same principles that are governing trade today in a new arrangement. We're going to have to open up a bit more opportunity for industrial policies and government intervention, but at the same time, recognizing that's going to mean we're going to have more frictions at the border when jobs and investments become threatened, because sometimes our development objectives are going to be different than China's development objectives, and they create a bit of a zero-sum game. And we're seeing that in the EVs or steel and aluminum, where one country has subsidized pretty heavily a very successful and now competitive industry. And if that's allowed in without any restrictions on it, it could potentially decimate employment here. So I think we're going to need to recognize that there's areas where things are incompatible, and thus find an agreement to put more restrictions on that.
Thank you.
I will come in if you want to. I think we need some context here. The context is this: the system difference makes a difference. It makes a difference because China is a Leninist system led by the Communist Party, in which all organs of the state, including the judiciary, are led by the Communist Party. So there are no independent courts in China. There are sometimes independent dispute mechanisms. The courts sometimes do rule in favor of foreign companies, but not if the government has actually a clear policy mandate against that. And so that means that if you have a dispute involving China, sometimes you won't get a fair shake necessarily in Chinese courts. And if the Chinese government decides that it wants to make a priority of something, it just makes a priority of something. And that means it's not a level playing field at that level. And China is now a very big player. To give you just a simple example, China produces more steel than the rest of the world combined. The rest of the world. So that, and therefore, China can export steel at a lower price and flood any market it wants in the world, any market, if there were no restrictions. So these are problems. Now, you asked the question, can we make deals? And here we have to, and I think Jeff was intimating, but perhaps too nuanced. Let me be a little bit more clear cut on this. On any individual dispute, China is willing to deal, unless national security is involved. And they will negotiate. And they will try to come up with solutions. China will try to come up with solutions to individual kinds of dispute. But it will not negotiate over its system. And any time one brings up its system, that simply gets the Chinese back up, and they will leave the table if necessary. So I think Jeff was sort of hinting in that direction. We have to look at it more that way. But he's saying that China also has to recognize that as the elephant in the room now, even when it moves sideways, it's going to affect other countries, regardless of whether it intends to hurt them or not. Mm. But given the very self-centered nature of its rule and its goals to be dominant, if not rule the world, or at least not be second to anybody else, then that creates problems. And that includes technology as well. That China simply, and here we have we do have a self-fulfilling prophecy between the United States and China. The United States does not want to be behind China, and China doesn't want to be behind the United States. And every measure that each of them takes in order to protect its future affects the other in ways that the other considers as a negative on their space, and I don't know. It's not really resolvable at this point at that level. There will be friction, and so the question is, well, can we have a positive sum game? Can we have a positive sum competition, or in which basically we both push each other and we both make a better world, or we have a negative sum competition. We push each other in ways which a gain for you means a subtraction for me, and I have to therefore hurt you.
Look, I'm not an economist, so this may sound silly, but my impression is that Trump just gave them the whole game. That the whole rules that he's the international order of how things get done with tariffs and all, the way things are getting done. He's made policy changes that will just simply be unworkable for the U.S. and that it's just a matter of time now because China's going to eat our lunch, or at least eat the U.S. lunch. Am I being ridiculous? Or I think a lot of people real economists would agree with me.
Ellen, I think, hasn't had a chance to had her hand up. So if you
Right, there's so many different threads in this discussion that I'll try to run through a few of these quickly. I think that it's quite right that we used to have a much better base with China than we do at present. And there are many different dimensions of possibility that we have before us. So, when I was first encountering China, it was an era in which there were very many Canadians who had quite a deep connection with China during the first part of the 20th century. And I was just stumbling across these people and their children and their grandchildren for a long time. They reflected the way in which Canadians have been engaging with China in a basically positive way, without overlooking the fact that the experience of the first Chinese coming to Canada was not entirely good. But Chinese people have contributed a great deal to the Canada we have today, and there have been a lot of positive engagements between Canada and China for a very long time. For most of my life, actually, it's been positive. But it has certainly taken a different turn for the last little while, and that, I think, is what is troubling all of us at the present time. My take on this is probably a little bit different, as my experience as a student in China was we always felt rather constrained in terms of being in a foreign ghetto and so on. And so I spent most of my time trying to get to the countryside and to where regular people were, and looking at the processes of change that have happened in China from the 1970s through until fairly recently. So I think that Jeremy's certainly right, that there's a great deal of confidence that within Chinese society, that despite all of these twists and turns, China's been able to correct things that didn't go well in a way, and basically take a country that looked a lot like the most devastated parts of the region today into what it is now since 1949. So there's a degree of confidence in their own way of doing things that is rather different from our own, that I think it's quite right they're not about to abandon. And one of the things that we have to do is to come to accept that there are different ways of being in the world, and to work this out in some rather complicated way given the interconnected world that we're in right now. I think we get sometimes, because we really just, in the general perception the people not involved with China have, we sort of just see states moving and doing things, and trade relations and political moves, and that is just sort of the top of the iceberg in a sense. So we have much more significant relations when we look at China as a whole and the larger community that we think of as being part of. And it's trying to move into being part of that larger community as a country, a very populous country that thinks that it has a significant place in the world. And that has been very unsettling in some quarters. And it's been particularly unsettling for the United States, that has been accustomed to being the leading power in the world for a number of decades. So I think that is one of the things that's particularly difficult. I think, date the change when things started to get difficult to be around about the time the United States made this pivot to Asia. And I think that what that was a response to China's sustained economic rise, so that it was becoming more of an actor on the world stage, and also to the global financial crisis. So to some extent, we have a lot being disrupted because we now have great powers trying to exert themselves on the global stage. And then, so we have two elephants in the room, perhaps, you could say, so that the rest of us have to adjust in some way to that. And China's wonderfully good at very many things. It has transformed the lives of its population. It's a power in science and technology. It's culturally very significant. It's not very good at PR. So what we basically have is a situation in which we learn about China very largely through the United States. And one can imagine how difficult that is. So basically we get something that's unnecessarily antagonistic, at least from my point of view. It may be necessarily antagonistic from other people's point of view. But basically, I think we don't always have an appropriate recognition of the legitimacy of China's economic rise. It's just seen as a threat. Whereas, it was just a few years ago that China was celebrating getting the last several 100 million people over its poverty line. So, basically it does have an enormous transformation that it is responsible to do for its own people. And it's doing it differently. And it's not a liberal democracy, but it is, I think, more responsive to its people than we give it credit for. Because basically, if you look at, it is a Leninist system, as Jeremy says, but one of the features of the Chinese system is that it has throughout been utterly dependent on popular support for anything it wanted to do. And it understands that it is, in a sense. So we have these extreme course corrections from time to time. I don't think, and it's a different kind of accountability. And I worry a little bit that in the era of financialization, it's not as dependent on the labor of everybody and the popular support of hundreds of millions of people. But still, I think we have some characterizations of it as being antagonistic and dictatorial that I'm a bit uncomfortable with, because there's a strong state, but there's strong people who resist and make change too. So I think that
I'm sorry, you don't like to hear it called a dictatorship?
what
Is that?
I think it's being described that way, but I'm not describing it that way.
And that's what I'm saying. It bothers you to call it that. Is that right? I would call it that. So, I mean, you other guys, do you call it that? I mean, I'm trying to pick a fight with Ellen. Ellen's always so.
I mean, are we right? I think that when that term is used, it's basically pejorative. And if you want to look at the world today, I think one could apply that term just as well to the United States. So it's so I think it's just not helpful. I think that the political processes in China look very different from the ones here, and we're in an era of very troubled political processes that, if we look at them carefully, we shouldn't be any too comfortable about what's happening most places that we can think of. So the moment we're at right now, I think, is one of very difficult, great power conflict that's having an impact on ordinary people all around the world. And smaller countries like Canada, and we're very fortunate to be in a country like Canada with its abundant resources and a lot that we can be very grateful for. But we're still vulnerable to all of these larger things that are going on in the world. So I think we don't want to simplify what's going on a great deal. The bit that worries me that I think might want to talk about is just this escalating conflict between the great powers. And I think I would like us not to be too deeply involved in that. So that if we go in a direction where we work more at building up Canada and having more relations with other countries and with a global community that doesn't have to be totally enmeshed in great power conflict, it would be better. Now, I'm not going to be a Pollyanna who says I think we're necessarily going to get there. I think it's a very big problem. But if we want to look towards a place where we want to go, I would like to see us trying not to be too enmeshed in those dynamics. And I'm worried that we have been drawn very much into the American view of demonizing China. And it would be good to pull back, and it would be good to pull back from that. And I hope that that is one of the directions in which things might go, in which we diversify our political and economic connections with other countries and not be drawn into that. And the dimension, I'll sum up very quickly, the dimension in which I think I'm particularly worried about right now is something that sometimes we don't talk about quite directly enough about China because we're talking about trade and economics all the time. But I'm a bit concerned about the conflictual part of it. And today is Hiroshima Day, after all. So we're getting notions presented that China is a really dangerous adversary, and a push to increase our military spending and the Golden Dome and all of that. And I think that it's really important to be able to pull back from the militarization of economic competition.
I think we can join some of these things together.
I want to jump in because I think some really, really good points have been made. And earlier, Meta, you asked, has U.S., because of its abrogation of leading, the liberal world order, has that given away the store for China? And then Ellen pointed out a couple of different threads that I think tie into that. One being, I call it the new economic security regime, and this notion of great power conflict and where is Canada's role in all. I think one of the challenges is that with the U.S., they are reacting against China's rise. They're reacting against a relative power decline. They see all sorts of security issues going on around the world, and so they are very much changing tack, and they're no longer going to underwrite this system, this liberal rules-based system. But China's yet not necessarily, as reasons people pointed out, going to be able to step up and lead that same system either. One such reason is because of the economic situation there, where its system has closed capital controls. And so part of it, its system has been designed in some ways to work very, I don't want to say exploit, but to be able to maximize its, fitness with the current international rules. So once the U.S. changes tact and other countries start changing tact, all of a sudden, whether or not its system is going to be able to deliver the same kind of results is going to be called into question. And one of the key things is, as you mentioned at the very outset, Meta, and Jeremy too, about how much China's risen in its capability of production. What is happening right now is the U.S. is such a powerful situation around the world, and why it's been able to force some countries into lopsided deals is because it is willing to import products from the rest of the world. China hasn't stepped up to be the big anchor of the global economy. So I really actually see we're not moving from a U.S. system to a China-led system. We're in this really mushy transitionary period, which I characterize as an economic security regime. And it's precisely because economics and military or security issues are becoming increasingly intertwined, dual use technologies at the technological frontier, or even in traditional industries like steel and automotives are needed to create that hard military power. So when the US says we're cutting out countries for steel and auto because we want to build up these industries, it's quite concerning, because they're trying to reshore up their hard power capabilities. And this is where someone mentioned about this push and pull dynamic, whether it gets positive some or negative some. And that's really where we are, because this transitionary period, we don't know which direction things are going to go. And there is a logic that can make this very negative sum and spiral out of control. But rather than Canada stepping out and trying to avoid the great power conflict, I actually think Canada needs to return to its old roots as trying to be a trusted middle power. No one's going to trust the United States right now to broker fair and honest deals. But part of the reason the United States is reacting right now is because of this mismatch in economic systems. Canada needs to be able to rise above and see that there is this going on, that like the EV, the steel and aluminum, all these things are actually just particular instances of a broader general phenomenon. And I think we should actually be using the upcoming joint economic and trade commission meetings between Canada and China that Prime Minister Carney announced back in late June as a vehicle to start defining new principles so that we can create a precedent for trying to solve some of these economic conflicts in a much more managed way. And you're going to have to recognize national security concerns as part of that. And that's a way for Canada to, one, increase its independence, because the United States, as part of our economic and security negotiations, is looking to limit Canada's political autonomy internationally. And so if we're able to find a way that can rectify some of the same concerns that the US has with China, but in a more positive sum approach, that's a contribution Canada can do to move this in a more better direction.
You haven't mentioned, nobody so far has mentioned AI. And I spend my whole evenings watching videos of talking about AI. And clearly there's some, this is coming up on us 2 or 3 years, and it's going to look totally different. People in business and in trade and all are talking about this as if we're in some sort of transition, but I don't see any concern about what the AI thing is going to do to the global economy and to the relations between China, who very well may get to AGI before anybody else. Have any of you folks been talking about that, even in the dead of night in secret?
I was just at a workshop in China where we talked about AI and the social sciences. We talked, and AI is very much front and center in Chinese thinking, both at the government and at the non-government level. I mean, here, if you want to have capture some of the nuances of China, just take this as an example. President Xi Jinping learned about DeepSeek at the same time you and I did.
Really?
Yes. This is not a state-led effort. This was a private sector effort, which reached success in a private sector platform, and the Chinese government learned about its success at the same time you and I did. So we should not think of China as some kind of state-led juggernaut.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you can turn the stakes around in a different kind of way. ByteDance, the owners of TikTok, have probably more influence in Washington than they have in Zhongnanhai in Beijing, in the Forbidden City in Beijing. I mean, that's just the way in which the system is more complicated than you think. And going back to the earlier discussion about authoritarianism and democracy, I mean, we in the West have this dichotomous view: either you're a democracy or you're authoritarian, and all authoritarians are all the same. But that's a very cartoonish figure. I mean, China, the United States is a democracy. Israel is a democracy. Israel is a democracy in which my sister has been demonstrating for 5 years against the government and has had no impact.
Mhm.
Um, and the United States is a democracy in which people are demonstrating in which people have no impact. So at the same time, China is an authoritarian state from this perspective. Power is centralized, but as Ellen said, the government responds. When people went out in the street in Shanghai against the zero COVID, they they turned around the policy within 2 weeks.
It's really interesting.
I want to get back to something about the joining of the economic and the military, and Jeff Mans. One of the problems we have, okay, we're overly dependent on trade with the United States. Almost 80% of our trade goes to the United States, and we're tied into American production lines. So, for example, because of this, for example, we went outside of WTO rules to ban Chinese EVs in Canada. Without any investigation, without anything, we just simply banned them because we were worried about access in manufacturing from our cars to being able to access to the United States. The United States didn't give us any brownie points for this. They slapped up tariffs on us anyways. But we went outside this because we were worried about but the problem is China's not going to buy any car made in Canada. There's no reason for it to buy it. So the things that we sell to the United States, we can't sell to China.
Okay, what would you do?
So we have a real problem. But let me take it one step further.
Okay.
One reason why we're raising our defense spending is to shore up our manufacturing in Canada, because this is part of the government's budget. And we're trying to cooperate with the Europeans, etc. It's not just a military policy. We are hoping that the United States will recognize us and therefore give a better access to our market. That's part of the calculation. But even if the United States doesn't give us that, we're hoping that will keep up our high value manufacturing. And
I think
that's a very dangerous road to take. But the question is, we have very few options, because the things that we can sell to the United States, we cannot sell other places.
I do understand that it's an industrial and trade policy. I think that just very briefly, if there's an alternative, I think, although it may not be quite so rapid, I think it might be in science and technology and in communications. If we could lead further in innovation, we could, Canadians created the BlackBerry, after all. There are things that we might be able to do in new and emerging areas of technology that might allow us to do something other than the military technology. So I recognize that economic strategy. I'm hoping there's something else we can do.
It's not an either or. But I think Jeremy's, I completely agree with that assessment. And that's why we need to find some way to get a new modus vivendi with China, where they recognize that we had to block out their EVs because of the effects it could potentially have on those integrated supply chains. Canada's announcement on steel just a few weeks ago that we were going to essentially create a common North American steel tariff policy in a lot of ways. Targets Chinese steel amongst other countries. But that's precisely because while we haven't reached the deal with the US on this, they've made clear that if we want to have market access there, that we're going to have to play along. And China, as not just on EVs, they're not going to buy our steel either. And the US has made clear that it's concerned that Chinese steel is being transshipped through Canada, and that's part of their rationale for the 232 tariffs and what they've put on Canada as part of that. So it's
I'm not sure what either of you recommend as a solution to this problem. I mean, I'm not even sure whether you agree. Can't Canada just say, well, okay, we made a mistake, we'll buy your EVs? And what would happen if you did?
No, we shouldn't do that. We
Why?
need, if to the extent that we work with China on EVs, it should be maybe making it more clear that Chinese investment would be welcome in certain segments of the supply chain so that it could increase jobs, investment, and economic activity. Because in the economic aspect of the economic security regime is jobs and investment are of critical importance, and market access is a tool that can be used to impact those levels. So if Chinese EVs come in here, that risks shutting down or disintegrating Canada's role in the North American automotive supply chain. But to the extent, as was done with Japan and others in the past, if we can find ways where China can contribute to that economic activity within Canada that raises investment and jobs, then that's an avenue we should be considering.
Exactly. So China has superior battery technology. They have the best battery technology in the world.
Yeah.
So if they could manufacture batteries in Canada, that would help our EV industry in Canada. But that would require, that, as Jeff says, that requires more cooperation and somehow trying to find out some way of working something out with the United States. It's going to be not going to be easy.
Well, that's what I'm thinking.
It's not going to be easy.
If the game is that the U.S. is now saying, we're not going to play with you on cars anymore, and you're on your own. I don't understand why the perfect answer to that isn't to say, okay, we'll go to China and we'll buy their cars, or
because then we won't have an auto industry in Canada.
Yeah,
our auto industry is dependent on export to the United States. So that's a very simple reason.
And there's no way around
so there will be no auto industry in Canada at all.
Yeah. And the other reason we can't quickly just turn the taps and say, okay, Chinese investment coming in, is we don't have certainty that Trump is truly going to be cutting us out of the automotive. Indeed, we're characterized by uncertainty right now. We have the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, which is enabling this integration to go on, but it's at threat. Some aspects of Canadian automotive exports are hit by those 25% tariffs that were announced as part of his national security tariffs a few months ago. But as we move forward to these negotiations, like last week, we know that more tariffs were put on, but it's actually only hitting a small percentage of Canadian exports. But the US is going to likely try to tighten up further rules on Canada as these renewal negotiations for CUSMA come forward over the next several months before July 1st. And so Canada doesn't have certainty that we're being fully kicked out. If Canada is fully kicked out of the US, well, then yes, that could be a plausible path forward. But it's going to come, as Jeremy points out, at the expense of losing all that supply chain. So right now we need to get creative and keep our eyes on the prize, which is maximizing jobs and investment and economic activity in Canada. And the way I think that we can do that means we have to change some of our approach for dealing with China. And in some ways, we actually have to become more Chinese. China manages economic integration with the rest of the world, not in a neoliberal fashion that Canada does. It says, okay, there's certain sectors where you can come in and invest, no real restrictions, just, play ball. Others where they say for national security or other reason, it's prohibited, completely out of bounds. But then there's this mushy middle where they say restricted, where you're welcome in, but under certain conditions. And it's more managed so that it guides the benefit to the Chinese economy. Canada needs to look at doing that kind of arrangement with China for both trade and investment so that we can minimize the negative sum impacts of our economic integration and improve the positive sum aspects, which will then fuel into resolving some of these political crises, which are ultimately in some ways a battle over jobs, investment, market access, technological commercialization, and all of those feed into power.
Okay, when all three of you agree that if the U.S. actually plays really, really, really hard and just makes it impossible for cooperation between Canada and the U.S. on car production, that the solution would be to try to make a deal with China to use their batteries. That kind of no. Jeremy says no. Okay, what's the deal?
Because the problem is this. China makes the world's best EVs at the lowest price because it has the world's largest automotive market. That's why it makes and it favored that technology in their production, and they were able to ramp it up, and they have more competition than they have too many. We can't compete with that.
Mhm.
We cannot in a million years compete with that. If we have a closed Canada only market, we will be making third-rate cars, which only Canadians would buy and nobody else would buy.
Jeff is nodding his head, but he's also made it clear that he's got to go right this minute. So goodbye,
That's right.
Million, and
Thank-
let's tidy up the ends of the conversation with the other guys.
Thanks. Thanks so much. I was really happy to join this conversation and participate with everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mitch.
Bye. Okay,
I want to let Ellen talk. I mean,
Yeah.
I think I don't want the boys to
Sure.
dominate.
yeah,
Fine with the direction that this discussion on the cars is going. I think it really is a very difficult problem because it affects so much of the Canadian workforce. It's going to be a complicated negotiation, and we're dealing with unpredictable actors, to put it mildly. In that broader picture, some of the things Jeff was pointing out about upcoming negotiations Canada might be part of. I don't know how much we can change the overall nature of the international trade regime. But the direction I think that we're broadly trying to go in, which is to strengthen Canada's economy and have more partners elsewhere so that we're not quite at the mercy of these two large elephants, is the direction in which we have to go. We have to balance economic decisions and the well-being of people against also having strategies that are too much connected with fossil fuels or with defense industry. Some of the choices available to us are probably not the best possible choices. There's a reason why the United States and China are both emphasizing science and technology so much. We need to move into new areas to the extent that we can.
yeah, Jeremy. I'm
I
going
do.
to give you the last word and it's not an easy thing to ask you to sum up, because I think we've opened a whole bunch of cans of worms that we haven't. I don't even know how to put the lid back on. Tell me your easy, quick solution to all of these problems.
There is no easy, quick solution. But I want to come back to something that Ellen said. Canada is generally still well regarded in China. And we still have friends in China. Now, China is a hard-nosed place and is bent on its own future. But there is room to try and get a bit. And I think we are in a difficult position. There's no question about it. And even in AI, the problem here is that, again, we're caught between technology wars between the United States and China. And, what will happen is if we try to cooperate with China on AI, the United States will cut off research funding to Canadian scientists. It's going to be a difficult situation. We'll have to navigate this somehow. But the point is that we should try, because we shouldn't cut off China because we're scared of them or because they're bigger and we haven't had a tradition of working with them. Right now, our best friends have turned against us. Mm-hmm. And we have people who have not been our traditional best friends, but actually they have they don't look at Canada mostly benignly and favorably. Everybody I met likes Canada. Mm-hmm. But we ended up. I know Michael Kovrig, by the way, and he spent 3 years in jail, almost 3 years in jail. One year of which was in solitary confinement, because he was a fall guy in a play between the United States and China, in which we arrested the equivalent of Elon Musk or Bill Gates at the behest of the Americans. And the Chinese felt they had to oblige by somehow. Now that has caused a strain, and it's difficult for Canadians to understand. It's difficult for Chinese to understand. Difficult for Canadians to understand how we can cooperate with a country which will keep an innocent man in jail for 3 years. And it's difficult for Chinese to understand is how we could arrest on the mere whim of the United States a person who is, as important as Elon Musk say, and without there being a reaction from China. That's what they say. I've said more than one person said we couldn't do nothing. We had to do something. So what we have to do is go back to trying to work to trust each other better. And yes, say to the Chinese, look, we have a difficult economic situation. If you want us to be able to be cooperative with you in so many areas, then you have to actually make space for us in your market too. You have to make space for us so that we are not as dependent on the United States. Now, they are not going to open up everything up for them, but there have to be areas in which we can expand our trade and expand our inroads in the Chinese market so that we are less dependent. And that requires better talk, better communication, and a slow building of trust. And I think Ellen would probably.
I thought we would be talking about things like democracy and human rights and geopolitics and international law and that kind of thing. But it's extremely influenced now, apparently, by trade considerations and the economy. And okay, if that's the way it is, I've learned something. That's the way you have to look at things right now. So it's hard for me to do, but I thank you all for this and really appreciate it. And let's pick it up and carry it forward another time, shall we? Thanks so much.
Okay, that'd be good. Thank you.
Okay, bye.